Now, if you want to cover the grain of the wood, so you don't want to, have that showing through, then you can just use a primer coat first, and maybe one with a gesso in it as well to sand down and make even smoother, a smoother finish than you've got already. If, like me, you prefer to sort of see an effect of the wood, after all, you've spent all your time carving it nicely out of wood, it's a shame sort of to cover it up entirely. You can just paint straight onto the wood, but what you don't want to do is have the paint soak in totally. If you remember from the first tutorial with the marionette, I sprayed it with some lacquer. We're going to do the same with this one. I've got just a clear lacquer here, which I'm going to spray coat it with first, just very lightly, and then once that's dry I'll sand it off and paint on. That just stops the paint from sinking in totally into the wood. It allows it to, particularly with acrylics paints, it allows them to be worked and moved around and blended a little bit more. If you put them straight on, because wood's obviously quite porous, it'll sink straight in and you won't be able to do much with it, and you'll end up with a very sort of stark flat finish. So this is what I like to do. As I say, it's entirely up to you whether you want to do this. You can also use boiled linseed oil and just give it a wipe with that, has the same effect, and then again just give it a quick rub over before you start painting. So I'm going to do that and then leave them to dry overnight, and then we'll look at the painting tomorrow. So it's literally just a light dusting over, and the reason I use a spray paint is it actually dries quite quickly, so it doesn't take long and remain sticky for too long. It's also makes it easy to get into all the little sort of nooks and crannies with it, rather than trying to get your brush in. Not worried too much about the back, because that's going to be covered with the hair anyway. There we go, that's more than enough. Probably a little bit too much maybe on there. As I say, you can just we'll sand it off anyway. We'll sand it back once it's dry. And just do the same with the hands. Quick once over. And make sure you've got ventilation if you're spraying indoors. You don't want to be breathing in the fumes. So we'll leave that to dry, and then just cut it back with a very fine sandpaper, maybe a 180 grit or something like that, or a 240, just to cut it back and allow the paint to so it allows the paint to sink in just a little bit, but not too much, not as much as this now seals the wood, so the paint will be sitting on top a little bit more. So after having rubbed down the hands and the head, I'm just applying a little bit of paint to show you how the sort of pre-lacquering or pre-coating works. I've got quite a thin coat of green here. It's worthwhile having a spare offcut of wood, and if you lacquer that as well, you can then test out on your spare piece of wood rather than testing out on your actual hands or head or whatever. So I've put a light, quite a thin wash coat on here, and you can sort of build up the colour as much as you want, but because it's already a lacquer coat on there, even though I've rubbed it down, it stops it from sort of sinking in entirely, so I can still actually rub it off to a degree and if I don't want such a dark colour or add a little bit of texture, I can still actually remove it back. If I hadn't pre-lacquered the wood, within a few seconds or a minute, I wouldn't be able to do that. This just means that it's not actually soaking in quite so much into the wood as it would do if it was unsealed. So you can sort of build up from there however much you want your colour to be. So that's obviously not quite enough, so I'm going to put some back on and just wash it on quite thinly, build up the colour in sort of thinner layers rather than really coating it on thickly, unless you want the really sort of a flat colour to it, a flat colour and a flat finish. And if you want to do that, you'd probably be better off priming it first, putting a primer coat on, which will then sort of soak into the grain and seal it better, and it means you'll get a nicer wash on there if you run a real sort of a flat colour. But for most sort of human characters, you don't want that. You want a little bit of variation, because skin tones, even though I'm doing this green because it's a witch, you wouldn't if you wanted sort of more realistic looking or more interesting looking, you want a little bit of variation in the colour, rather than being sort of dead flat green or skin colour. Obviously you don't have to do your witch green. You can use a skin colour if you wanted, or you could do a skin colour with a very light wash of green in it. Perhaps we'll have a go at that on the other hand in a minute, see what that looks like, just as a test. So as you can see, you can build up the colour in sort of light wash coats, and then that gives you the chance as well to then define areas that you want darker. So I'm going to, in a bit, darken off these grooves in here to sort of delineate the fingers a little bit more. So actually on the camera that looks quite green, even though it's actually not as green. It looks more like Kermit's hand, doesn't it? So pull that back off a little bit more and gives a nice sort of textured wash. Okay, so the hands are done with the first wash, so I'll just do the same with the head. And again, it's just really a case of, I'm going to just give it a very thin wash over as the base coat and build up from there. And then you'll see the highlighting that I'll put in afterwards, and you can pick out your definitions, particularly these areas in here for the jowls, and obviously around the eyes you want to define those more. You don't want to paint everything flat so you lose your lovely carving. You actually want to make that sort of stand out more, and so to do that we're going to do some colouring that brings that into show more, but that will hopefully become obvious a little bit later when we get as far as that. But so I'm going to carry on and do this, and then I'll come back when I've given it a nice wash coat over, and we'll look at some of the doing a bit of the detailing. Now obviously I don't want to paint into the eyes, but it doesn't overly matter if you get some in there at the moment, because we'll pick those out with white, but we don't want to paint them in green just yet. And if you're doing this sort of technique, don't go too far into your painting if you want to sort of do a pull of colour off, because you don't want to leave it to dry perhaps too long. Becomes more difficult to move around. So if you're wanting to do a sort of wash coat, and then sort of remove it a bit, perhaps do what I'm doing here and do sort of half the face, and then give it a wipe over and see where you are. You can see where the varnish, although I've rubbed it down, you can see where it's, in some places it soaks, it's still coating a little bit more than others. Probably where it's easier to rub down, where you rub off the high points here, you're going to get more of the varnish has come off, so therefore more of the paint has gone in. So we might need to correct a little bit of that afterwards. But anyway, I'm going to keep working with this. And then once this is done, we'll come back and look at some detailing. So now you can see I'm building up the highlights. I'm going to do both the light areas and the dark areas. Again, just using here, I'm using a white to pick out the real lighter spots, which are obviously the point of the nose, point of the chin, and then I'll do some on the cheeks. And I'm going to blend out on the forehead as well. So from the centre it'll be lighter and getting darker as it works back around the head. You might be better at sort of mixing your colours than I am. I tend to do it in sort of washes of laying on thin coats. Maybe if you're a better painter than I am, you can actually work your colours better, and you won't need to do it in such a fashion. You can perhaps mix your colours and blend them when they're a little bit more solid. I tend to use them quite watery, as you can see. It just allows me to move them around a bit more, particularly once it's been sealed. But I know some people do paint, with thicker colours, and they can do it a lot more accurately, the blending. But whichever way you choose to do it is obviously the way that you're comfortable with. So I pick out the light areas and the dark areas and sort of work them around. So the dark areas are going to be above the eyes, the eyelids, above the eyelids before the brow, and the back of the nose, and the jowls obviously in there as well. Anyway, you want to define a line. It's always a good way just to make it darker in the line and blend it lighter as it comes out, and it really makes that line stand out. I mean, you can see the jowls line on the carving there. It's fairly visible, but once you put the colour in, the dark colour, it'll really make it stand out even more. Obviously in the inners of the ears as well, that's a good place to put some dark shading in, so you can highlight the fact that you've dug out the ear channel as well. You can use the paint effects to, instead of carving, if you're really on the beginner's foot of carving and you're struggling with hollowing out places like your ears and the jowls, you can use the paints instead to pick those out and give the effect of depth there if you want to. So that's always an option for a more basic carving. But as we've dug out the ears there, I'm just going to make them even more visible by popping some darker paint in. you never want to use real sort of solid colours unless perhaps your puppet is more cartoony and dictates a real solid colour. But if you look at most things that are supposed to be particularly skin or fur or anything like that, I mean, if you just look at my hands, for example, it's not a solid colour of skin, or even if it is, it's the way that the areas are picking out light and dark that you get those different shades. So a little bit of shading always makes something look a whole lot better than a real flat colour. So always try and work around that. So don't be worried about doing washes of colour and slight variations, because it just gives it a much more realistic look at the end of the day, or a much more interesting look, even if it's not necessarily realistic. It just gives it a lot more interesting character for your eyes. As you can see here, picking out the darker areas, the upper eyelids, around the nose, and the jowls particularly. So I've just used a black colour here and mixed it with a very small amount of the green colour, just to give a really darker shade of darkest green that's very, very nearly black. Just clearing off a little bit of the excess. Again, that's only because I tend to work with a very thin wash coat. If I was working with a thicker paint, I'd have to be more sort of accurate about where I put it and be a little bit quicker with the blending. So that's nearly done with the first wash of the darker and lighter highlights. Just picking out round the eyes there. We'll do the eyes next. But before we get to that part, I'm going to do the same thing with the hands. Just picking out the lines of the fingers, the definition lines of the fingers. Again, if you're having trouble with your carving, picking out those lines, and you've got more of a flat surface, you can paint those lines in to delineate the fingers. You will have to use a more solid paint to get a fine sharp line rather than the washes that I'm using, but but you can always do that. It's quite common for people to do on fingers, particularly if you want to just carve a flat surface and then just paint the shapes of the fingers in. That's perfectly acceptable to start. But really, again, just doing the same sorts of things, washing in the colour, working it around to get to where I need it to be. So you can see I've done a fair amount of shading in the colour. We'll just pick out the eyes now, and quite simply just going to get a quick wash over with a white first, and then I'm going to tone it down a little afterwards. Not always a good idea to have them totally bright white. This looks a little strange, so I always tend to just sort of wash them out very, very slightly. But first of all, it's just to get a nice sort of base colour in there. Need a smaller brush. So again, don't be afraid to build up the coats rather than trying to go thick on, get it on all with the first coat. It's okay to sort of build it up from thinner layers, get more control. And I'm no expert on painting by any means, so I'm sure there's plenty of you out there that will make a better job painting than I will. There we go, so just a light wash first of all, and then let that dry, and we can work out with some different colours, and then we can put the pupils in. Now you notice that the shading here, we've done light sort of tapering through to dark, so anything that's, if you imagine looking at the face front on, anything that is near to you, such as the nose, tip of the nose, chin and the cheeks, would be lighter and then fade out to darker as you go back, and then you can, it sort of highlights, emphasizes the nature, the sort of contours of the face. And also you can, by using darker, you can emphasize darker areas, particularly if you put any you know, like this line in here, the jowls, you can put a bit of dark colour in there, really sort of make that stand out as well. And then we can blend in a little of this extra light right on the tip of the nose, just to make that pop just a little bit more. Now you can use a brush, or you can use a sponge like I've got here as well. You can sort of use that to blend in quite nicely. If you're finding it hard work with the brush, you can use a sort of sponge to just blend the colours backwards. Right, so as you can see, I've done most of the shading that I want to. We now look at doing the eyes, painting in the eyes. Now obviously it's entirely up to you what colour eyes you want to do. I think I'm going to do yellow. I'll see what they look like anyway as yellow. So really what we're going to do is do the colour first before the black, and again you don't want a solid, too much of a solid colour. You want, in fact you want to sort of speckle it really, or streak it really. So doing sort of thin washes again is quite good for this this type of thing. Now I'm doing quite big irises here. Now because she's got her eye, this eye anyway, fairly open. We can just probably see the top of the circle on this one. And you could shrink it so you could actually see white beyond. Usually the way you paint eyes, you don't see the entire of the circle on a sort of normal eye. It would be framed top and bottom, and as this one's sort of squinting more, certainly we're only going to see the sides of the circle. So there's the first wash gone on. That's the main colour I'm going to use, and then I'm going to blend that out so it's sort of streaky, so there's going to be bits of white in there. You can put an outside line, a dark line, maybe black or a brown or a grey even, just to fix the outside of the colour and give it a sort of defining line. You don't have to sort of, again, that's something you might want to do just on part of the eye, maybe not on all of it, on the iris rather, just to give the impression of a line there, but not so solid that you actually go all the way around the outside, but I'll show you that when we get there. So that's the first wash, and then basically work your way in. Sort of, we want to try and make that sort of streaky white in there as well. Okay, so you can see that I've done some edging around the iris just to put a dark line there as definition, and I've done some extra shading, sort of white to light to dark, just popping in the pupils. So a little black dot in there for the pupils. Once that's dry, then you can pick out with a white just to give it a little bit of a highlight. You can either just put a spot in, a little round spot, or you can do a sort of, as I'm doing, a sort of streaky line that goes out from the pupil out to the edge of the iris. Just gives it a little bit more life, stops it looking quite so flat and dead. And I'm also just using the extra bits of white here just to pick out a little bit of extra definition. So when we put a little bit on the bottom lip there, and on the cheeks and on the nose, and we'll just blend that in a moment, just really to highlight those areas, give them a little bit more life, and so sort of blend it out so you get it rather than just a white spot, so you get it building from dark through to a really white point on the highlights there. Popping all those in, another coat of lacquer once you've finished your painting. Seal it with a coat of lacquer, and I quite often, on just the eyeballs, actually brush on a gloss varnish just to make them a little bit shiny, helps as if there's, it makes it look a little bit more real, as if there's a bit of water in the eye. So a matte finish to the rest of the face, but then a gloss on the eyes there. So that's it, and then we move on to making the costume.